I'm Avi. I have been programming for a very long time, but I'm also like deep down the AI pill. So I don't actually write code anymore. I barely read code, which is way different, but I still love it. And I kind of want to show you guys what I've been working on. So I work for a venture capital firm. We spin out a lot of apps. I also try to get my team and the portfolio companies to be able to vibe code on our apps. And yeah, so to kind of standardize stuff, because I started noticing that people, would start vibe coding an app, and suddenly I'd have like this Next.js app to integrate, or this Python app, and it used Flex, or some other framework, and there's like no standardization. It was kind of crazy. So I started building this Rails generator that is not like a Rails template. It's kind of like a starter kit, so when you generate the app, there's all the features like authentication and impersonation and, background jobs and payment, like if you kind of bought any starter kit. What's really special, though, is the AI harness that it comes with. So when you generate the app, it's shipping with a ton of skills and conventions built into it. So not through like marketplaces or plugins, but just packaged directly into the app. So that anyone using it, regardless of whether they know about those skills or can even invoke them, will get the benefits of all those. Which, again, and we've been finding it like super awesome. We can kind of go through all this, but I figure the demo is probably better. And just to kind of start out, here's where I generated a new app, right? It, went through a whole bunch of stuff, copied all the files from the generator, did a whole bunch, set up the environment, and then gave me the app. And to kind of demonstrate what we can do, here's Claude, obviously in YOLO mode. But yeah, let's think of what do you guys want to add to this app? Give me a prompt. Give me a feature. A blood pressure tracker? All right, I don't know what that means, but let's see what Claude does. Anything else you want to kind of tell it about? That's it? OK, cool. So I'll have Claude spin on that, because it's going to take some time. And then let's have Codex build something. All right, let's do something else, not a blood pressure tracker. Anything else you guys want to think of? All right, one that I've always had fun with is the Kanban board. It's got a lot of interactivity. Yeah.
You could add like time. You could add time.
OK, not sure exactly what that is, but let's go with the Kanban board. Right, and these are pretty minimal prompts. They're going to spin on that, and then we'll see what they come up with. Just to kind of show you what's going on with, let's see, where's Claude? Right, so, Claude is starting to ask some questions. One clarifying where our load conventions, hand off to see plans. So it looks for it wants trends. Do you want an actual chart visualization? Yeah. So what it's going to do, actually, so I want to kind of go over the skills. Compound engineering is incredible. There are a few things I disagree with in compound engineering, and what I found really useful is basically wrapping other skills. So this kicked off, and I didn't even tell it to go through to plan mode, and I'll kind of tell you how to do that, because getting models to implicitly invoke the right skills or workflow is kind of a pain. But it actually kicked off an RG plan skill, which actually did a few things first. One, it read all of my conventions, right? Kind of broke down the task a little before it handed it off to compound engineering. Figured out that it should ask me a clarifying question, and now it's actually going to start loading some convention skills, right? Like, what does a data layer look like in a Rails app? How do I domain model? What are my front-end conventions? Like, how do I architect things? I don't know if you guys like service objects. I'm a big fan of them, right? Hot wire skills. It knows that it's going to be somewhat interactive. My testing skills. I'm a big fan of RSpec and fixtures, right? It's going to basically build all that context and then hand off to compound engineering to plan and build. Same thing even before you get to like compound engineering work. There's another kind of wrapper skill that, again, just kind of really gets the context I want to hand off to that, because as great as compound engineering is with all of its research, I just find it sometimes to just not get the right patterns. So yeah, so Claude is spinning. So I have kind of two sets of docs that I ship with. One are convention docs, which are very much abstract code patterns. So like, how to use fixtures correctly, when to use a turbo frame versus a turbo stream, how to have stimulus controllers, use outlets correctly. And then you have like system docs, which are like not related to like abstract code patterns, but rather how does impersonation in this application work? Or like, in fact, after we build the Kanban board, I would write system docs for how does the Kanban board work, so that if anyone is ever editing or adding a feature to the Kanban board, the app will load the system docs that explain how that part of this application or the system works. So it's not suddenly like reinventing, oh, let me build a whole new model or something, So then it's finally going to hand off to compound engineering, and it'll kind of go from there. So while that's spinning, let me kind of just walk you through a few things about this. Codex and Claude are a little bit different, but for the most part are the same. One thing I found is that Codex is way better at implicitly figuring out the right workflow. Claude really needs guardrails. The guardrails I found that are super effective with Claude are, one, the session start hook. Just the second you start up any Claude instance, yell at it about all the things it needs to remember to do. Claude, in terms of context management, it really pays attention to stuff in the beginning of the context and stuff at the end and ignores the middle, which is why that 1 million token context window has nerfed the hell out of it, because you basically get like, okay, the first 25,000 tokens it's going to pay attention to, the last 25,000 and the other 700,000 mean nothing to it. So the session start hook is really good, like never stop, skip reading. I was always like really dubious of things like extremely important and like yelling at it. Do it, okay? Just be as explicit as you can. Always do this in capital letters, makes a huge difference. So the session start hook is great. Another thing I found really great is basically using guard hooks, right? So like I have this guard bash script, which basically is stopping Claude from running certain commands. So for instance, anytime Claude tries to run rspec directly through bash, this will stop it. And it stops it and tells Claude, you cannot run rspec natively. You have to use the agent rspec skill, which is basically a wrapper of how to correctly run rspec. So for one, I want it to run the entire test suite and write a JSON file to temp with the current status of the test suite, so that as it's building the feature, it's going to write the tests for that feature, make sure it passes. Then it's going to, when it's done, run the entire test suite again and basically check for regressions holistically, right? So agent rspec is really good at that. I won't let it push to main. Don't ever start the Rails server. It's always running. Things like that are really, pretty good, and you can get even more explicit with these guards. And then, another skill that I found really useful is like work trees. When you create a work tree in a Rails app, it will not copy over like your keys and things like that, right? Anything that's get ignored won't get copied over, which basically means your work tree does not work, right? So yeah, this is a special work tree. And that's, again, like compound engineering work tree skill doesn't get that. This is a special work tree skill that will actually make sure that when you create a new work tree, it is fully functional. Like you can go into it and start the server and run the test suite because it actually got all the files that your Rails app needs, right? So things like that I think are super important. And then in terms of the convention skills, one thing that I think we've all learned is you kind of want this pattern of thin skills, right, and like strong references. So instead of trying to build a Hotwire skill that mentions every single pattern Hotwire would need, all this skill is doing is basically telling it when do you use this and what other documents to read appropriately when this is invoked, right? So here it's kind of laying out, here are the individual convention docs to read. The skill is not the arbiter of what those are, so I can always add and edit these convention docs. The skill stays the same, right? And then just some checklists afterwards of what to verify, right? I also have all my skills output to me. It's the only way I know that they're actually running. So, you can see kind of here, it always tells me conventions loaded, what did you read? Which is why you get this kind of nice output, right? Like conventions loaded. If it skips one, I could stop it and be like, hey, you should be reading this other doc, right? And then, so those are kind of like all the code skills, right? I have like a browser test skill, how to use agent browser, how to log in correctly, a bunch of skills around like, I don't know if you guys write a lot of plans, I'm sure you do, but sometimes you forget to mark them as implemented, and you basically get like, I have 100 markdown files in here, I have no idea which I've done. So there's a nice skill to like mark them implemented and verify them. Yeah, kind of a bunch of other ones. And then in terms of like, again, also like whenever you can in any kind of skill, if you can ship like a shell script or, like a, basically a shell script, that could basically make sure it's going to do things correctly every time. Like, there's no reason for it to guess how to run rspec fail fast, right? This script will just make sure it always runs those commands correctly. Same thing with a work tree. Once the skill takes in, like, what do you want to name the work tree, there's a shell script that will always create it correctly and always, copy over the files correctly. The skill doesn't need to do that. And I guess one thing in general that, I've argued with Kyrian and a few other people I really respect in the kind of edge of AI is, they're like, you're fighting the models. They're just going to get smarter. And the whole point of AI is that it's non-deterministic. And you're writing all these guardrails to basically make it somewhat deterministic, which is a losing battle. And then also, as the models get smarter, your conventions are going to hinder it from writing good code. I don't buy that at all. I am like very much trying to, I want it to generate code, but I want it to be non-determined. I want it to be deterministic about some things, right? Like, there's just things I don't want it figuring out, depending on the day and its mood. So there's kind of this constant struggle of like, where am I going to stop it from its normal behavior, and then where am I going to let it just do what it wants? So yeah, like that's why I think these shell scripts are a really kind of good example of that. The second that you tell the model to use a script, it'll never get it wrong. You've basically went back to the way we used to program and stuff. And then in terms of like the convention docs, one of the places where obviously AI, with Rails, I think is pretty weak is like the cutting edge stimulus and hotwire stuff. Right? Like when they were training these models, there just wasn't, 37 Signals wasn't open sourcing all these apps. There wasn't a ton of open source stuff to like read in terms of like how stimulus outlets work. Even things of like when do you use a turbo frame or a turbo stream, right? How do you broadcast updates from a background job? These are kind of pretty discrete patterns, and it just doesn't know about that stuff. And it'll just reach towards, especially in a long prompt, it'll just get lazy and start writing inline JavaScript for you, which is always fun to find out. So yeah, like, when I look at like the turbo streams one, and in general, when I'm writing a convention doc, right, you basically want to describe when is this pattern used, and then you want to give it good examples and bad examples, and you generally want anything you're feeding to the model automatically, whether it's a skill or a convention doc, you want it to be as small as possible. Because again, you're plugging it with context. If this was 1,000 lines of TurboStream conventions, it would pay attention to the first 100 and the last 100 and ignore the middle and just totally ignore it. So I try to keep these as small as possible. Like this is, basically I try to keep them all under 200, which means that I have to be pretty choicey about what I want to include or break it up into a separate document. Right? With TurboStreams, again, how to broadcast is pretty, it gets it wrong a lot if you're trying to broadcast, especially from like a background job. Naming channels, it gets wrong all the time, right? Like, you always want to scope it as specifically as possible and go down, never ever use a string. You're always giving it resources. Rails will always give it the correct name. Don't put global streams in the layout. That's a terrible idea. Always embed it in the view, right? When to use update, when to use replace, right? Things like that. When do you respond with the right status code, depending on things like that. Always use partials with the DOM ID. That's, native turbo events over custom stream actions, things like that, right? It just keeps on going. And then the last thing is to give it a checklist. And again, because this is on the bottom of the file, it will actually pay attention to that. So even if it didn't read the middle of it, because there's a checklist, it's going to be go back and say, oh, I didn't do this. Where do I look for how to do that correctly? And basically all of them, follow this kind of pattern, right? Like, stimulus communication, right? How to use, outlets and have controllers talk to each other, right? There are front-end conventions like how to use icons, Flash messages, CSS, by the way, even though Tailwind tells not to do this, I use apply very judiciously with Tailwind. Models won't get that. I like building my own components with Tailwind classes. So yeah, just all these kinds of things, right? And there's a lot of them. One thing that I've done is I actually have an eval framework for this whole generator. So I can basically generate Docker containers and put a pretty full Rails app into 2 containers. One is the treatment container, which is that Rails app with none of the skills or conventions, and none of the AI harness. And the other one, sorry, that's the control one. The other one is the treatment container, which has all the skills on the harness. And then I have basically a set of prompts I'm giving it around these conventions. And both of them are following the prompts, and I get to see what code they generated. Because they're in Docker containers, they're entirely isolated. They write a whole bunch of forensic output into the container. When the containers are done spinning, I take that out because I can't have the container itself run evaluations on how well it did because it will just lie. So I take that stuff out, and then I have a whole bunch of criteria. And I can say, OK, the 2 apps both had to build a Kanban board, right? Let's evaluate how well they use turbo streams. And what I can find is, if 8 out of the 10 times the control basically was able to get my conventions and build good turbo streams, I no longer need that convention. I can trim it out, and I can get rid of it. The models are very consistently able to meet those, meet that. In the same way in the treatment, right? If I had a convention and it did not follow it at all, that convention needs to very much be improved, right? I can also tell, did it even follow the skills? Did it go into planning mode? Things like that. And I basically run those evals, basically, again, 10 runs for each 2 things. It's about 40 different prompts. They take a good 2 hours to run. But every week I can assess, what is the status of these conventions, how is it doing, and make choices and trim it down. So yeah, let's see where we're at here. So Codex is still spinning. And oh, I forgot to start it working. So Claude likes permissions. It did all the planning. Let's go. So now it'll actually start going into RG work against the plan file. And we'll see what we get. Codex is still going. Let's see, what else is cool in here? So yeah, I mean, again, if we look at the app, as I said, it does come with a whole bunch of features built into it, like streams, right? Which is good too, because this code helps it, not go crazy, right? So again, background job broadcasting, right? Even a redirect from a background job. Cool, right? Modals, right? A basic modal, a modal from a turbo frame, confirmation modal with removing the data, right? So this is all these are all these features already packaged into the app, right? That you can demo here, right? Tables, you don't have to figure those out, right? Obviously, a reveal, all this standard stuff, that you'd want, or at least I would want, when I'm starting an app, right? Oops. Oh, cool. So that's the migration from our blood pressure reading. I'm so excited to see what it came up with and how it interpreted that feature set. So yeah, that's, and it comes with an admin system, as I said. Oh, nuts. All right, let's just do it. All right, users, monthly tenancy, accounts. It has some other gems I like RailsPress is my blog engine or content management system. One thing actually that's pretty cool is it's not just the AI harness. These apps are very much built to build AI features, and there's a lot of different ways in which I use AI. So I build basically a wrapper object that wraps things like Ruby LLM and other AI stuff because sometimes I have to reach for like the batch API for OpenAI or Anthropic, and nothing supports that. So I need to drop down into like a custom OpenAI client. So yeah, Ask is going to use Ruby LLM, right? There we go. I have like basically different kinds of like prompt objects. One I really like, DispBRB, which uses kind of other kinds of styles, prompt engine, whatever. But this is all kind of built in. I even have like PG vector and nearest neighbor stuff set up. So all right, that's it. Hopefully one of these is done spinning. Let's see. Nope. We should have gotten Claude going. All right, but I'll show you guys, because this is still going, and I promise you it'll be OK. Just really quick. I did kind of smoke test this before. So this was Codex building a Kanban board. Same, just one-shot prompts, right? Create a board, right? Awesome, right? That was just one shot, 11 minutes. And then I had, let's see, is this it? I think it was 3,500. I had Claude try to build a Notion clone, because I thought that was going to be a nice test. And then I'm done, I promise. Let's see. Nope, OK. It must have been a different server. Anyway, so that's the Rails generator. I'm speaking at Blast Off Rails in June, where I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about this, and then I'm probably going to open source it. If anyone wants access to it now, I can add you on GitHub. Just hit me up afterwards. I'm on Twitter or X, whatever. Avi Flombaum. I'm sure Scott will share it, and I'll give you guys access, and I'd love feedback. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Hope that was fun. So slow. All right. Cool.